Great to see everyone. Great to be together this morning. If you would like a translation of the service, please just use that QR code up on the screen and you'll be able to access one through that. And if anyone hasn't got a Bible still and would like a Bible, please do put up your hand and hopefully one will be brought to you. And we're back on page 885. 885, and we're continuing in our series in the Gospel of Luke and chapter 24, and we're thinking about verses 13 to 35 this morning. And we've got a sermon search prize for Elsa. Well, it's still Easter Sunday, and given that it was almost evening when these two disciples got to the village of Emmaus, it must have been about mid-afternoon that these two disciples set out on their 7-mile walk from Jerusalem. And what a week they had had. A week that they are talking about and discussing as they walk. It was only a week ago that Jesus had ridden into Jerusalem on a donkey, surrounded by all those crowds, a clear fulfillment of Zechariah 9 and of the Messiah coming to save his people. And the crowds had recognized it. People, they were shouting out and they were full of joy. And they were praising God and they were acknowledging Jesus as their king, as Israel's king. And clearly these two disciples had recognized it. They knew about Zechariah 9. And for them it could only mean one thing, verse 21, that Jesus was about to redeem Israel, that Jesus was about to save them from their pagan overlords, the Romans, and set them free from their captivity. And no doubt in their minds, they were thinking back to the time of Moses and how God used Moses to rescue Israel from slavery in Egypt and how the Passover had first begun. And now at this time of Passover, as thousands and thousands and thousands of pilgrim Jews were flooding into the city of Jerusalem, they felt sure that God was going to do the same again. And they saw Jesus as this new Moses, one who God was going to use to rescue them from their captivity. And to them, it was just all so exciting. It was all so exciting. And they were kind of living during that week on the kind of the edge of their seats. And yet only 5 days later, instead of Jesus rescuing them from the Romans, their great hope was crucified by the Romans, delivered up to the Romans by their own chief priests and rulers of all people, and they just couldn't believe it. They couldn't understand it. It had all seemed so right, and yet it had all gone so wrong. And though some strange things have been happening that very morning, reports of an empty tomb, sightings of angels, a message that Jesus was alive, if you look on their faces in verse 17, you can see that they just don't understand what's going on. And for them, though the tomb is empty, Jesus is still dead. And they are down. And they're in despair. And they have no hope. And then a stranger draws near. And verses 13 to 24, Jesus walks with them. Now, we don't know for certain who these two disciples are. And none of the other Gospels include this journey to Emmaus, which kind of fits with how Luke operates and works, because Luke loves to include in his accounts interaction with people who are ordinary and who are unnamed and who are unknown. We know that what one of them is called Cleopas, but the other one remains unnamed. Some suggest that this unnamed disciple is Cleopas' wife, suggesting that this is Mary, the wife of Clopas, who John tells us about in chapter 19 and verse 25. Clopas being a variant on the spelling of Cleopas. We just don't know. Clearly they are part of the wider group of disciples who were there in verse 9 when the women returned from the empty tomb. And as they walk, they talk and they discuss and they debate and they dispute and they even argue and question kind of what has been going on over the past few days, verses 14 and 15. And as is so often the case when disciples talk together about Jesus, Jesus himself draws near. You find that, don't you? When you talk to a fellow disciple about Jesus, Jesus by his Spirit, he draws near to you, and you find that your heart is wonderfully warmed as you talk to each other about the Savior. Well, Jesus doesn't just draw near to them by his Spirit, verse 15, he draws near to them in person. But like Mary Magdalene, when she saw the risen Jesus, she was prevented from recognizing him. She didn't realize that it was Jesus. The same thing happens to them, verse 16. These two disciples, they are prevented, they are kept from recognizing Jesus. And I just want to kind of stop there and think about that for a moment, because I find that fascinating. I think that's odd. I would have thought that their greatest need at this point in time is to see the risen Jesus and to recognize him. Surely that is their greatest need. Surely their greatest need at this point in time is to have their sorrow turned into joy. It's to have their night turned into day. Surely that is their greatest need. And yet that's not their greatest need at this point. There's something else that they need. And so Jesus stops them from recognizing him. Their greatest need at this point is not to recognize the risen Jesus in front of them. And it's a bit like that with us sometimes, isn't it? So often as we go through times of sorrow and night and darkness and despair and disappointment, Jesus, he's right there with us. He's right there with us, but we just don't see it. And we don't see him. And we kind of think, surely my greatest need at this point in time is to have my sorrow turned into joy. For Jesus to make himself very real to us. But it doesn't always happen immediately. And that's because often God has something to teach us in our nighttime. Jesus asked them what they're talking about, verse 17, and they stop walking and stand still, looking sad. Shell-shocked by the events of the past few days, they have to stop walking to tell him about them. And you notice how the conversation unfolds. In verse 25, he will tell them that they are foolish, but clearly they think that he's the daft one. They think that he's foolish. He asks them what they're talking about. And verse 18, Cleopas asks him in disbelief, "Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" What do you mean, what are we talking about? Don't tell me you haven't heard. What have you been doing with your weekend? How can you be so ignorant? Are you daft? Are you stupid? Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days? And verse 19, Jesus asks, what things? I don't know about you, but I just find that funny. It's almost humorous. If anyone knows what has happened in Jerusalem over the past few days, it's him. He's the one who's ridden into Jerusalem on a donkey with all the crowds cheering. He's the one who was arrested and put on trial and delivered up to the Romans and who hung on the cross. He's the one who was in the tomb and has risen. If anyone knows what has happened over the past few days, it's him. And yet he innocently asks, what things? And he gets them to tell him all that they know. He wants them to put all the pieces of the puzzle that they have in their hands out on the table in front of them. He wants to lead them to a position of understanding and faith, because it's not that they're unbelievers. It's not that they're unconverted. It's just that they're confused and they're not clear in their faith. And so Jesus, he skillfully, he draws out the whole story from them, verses 19 to 24. Who they'd understood Jesus of Nazareth to be, a great prophet used powerfully by God. How the chief priests and rulers had had him crucified when they had hoped that he would redeem Israel. They tell him about the empty tomb, the missing body, the angels who had told the women that he had risen, the disciples who confirmed the empty tomb, but who didn't see a risen Jesus. He gets them to lay all the pieces of the puzzle that they have in their hands out on the table. He gets them to tell him everything that they know, and you think in any moment now, it's all going to fall into place. And the light is going to go on in their eyes, and they're going to not just see him standing there, they're going to recognize him. But it just doesn't happen. And so, verse 25, Jesus said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And so verses 25 to 27, Jesus teaches them. Now, what do you think of Jesus' pastoral manner? What do you think of Jesus' pastoral manner? Jesus, he doesn't comfortingly kind of nod his head and say, "Yes, I understand. I understand. I sympathize you in your confusion and your despair and your hopelessness." He doesn't kind of encourage and say, well, you got quite a bit of it right. What do you think of Jesus' pastoral manner? Jesus, he calls them foolish. He says, "Oh, foolish ones, you just don't get it, do you? You just don't understand. You haven't seen the obvious." You know, have you ever wondered why, when God wanted to use an animal to give us a picture of what we as God's people are like, have you ever wondered why the animal that God most commonly uses is a sheep? Have you ever wondered why? I mean, why didn't God say we're like lions and we're strong and we're noble? Or we're like eagles and we're swift and we're graceful? Or I would like owl, like we're wise and we're intelligent. Well, why did God choose sheep to most describe his people? Well, partly because sheep are vulnerable and they're defenseless and that they need someone to protect them. But partly because one of the defining traits of sheep is they're stupid. One of the defining traits of sheep is that they are stupid. They're always getting into trouble. They never seem to see the obvious. And they need a shepherd to look after them and to care for them and to keep them in the right way. Now, I don't want to be the one that breaks this to you, but someone has to. You are foolish. You are foolish. I am foolish. I'm foolish. We're all foolish. You know, so much of the time we think that we have got things sussed. We think that spiritually we're on top of things. We think we've got everything theologically sorted out. We think that there's not much more to find out about God and Jesus and his word. We think we are completely on top of things when actually most of the time we just don't see the obvious. And we're foolish. And it's really quite liberating when you realize it. We are no different to these two sheep who are walking to Emmaus, and it should humble us and it should put us in our place. But not only does Jesus tell them that they're foolish, but he also tells them that they are slow to believe all that the Bible says. Jesus said to them, "O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken." So they had believed some of what the Old Testament scriptures had said about the Christ, the Messiah, but they hadn't believed all that the Old Testament scriptures had said about the Messiah. Why didn't they believe all that the prophets had spoken? Well, because it didn't all fit into their concept and biblical framework of what they thought the Messiah would be and do. And so when the prophet said something that didn't quite fit, instead of changing their framework or their concept of the Messiah, they tried to explain it away. You see, that's why they're so foolish. That's why Jesus is calling them foolish. Because to give more weight to what you think the Bible should say than you give to what the Bible actually does say is just complete foolishness. It's complete foolishness. And it's something I think that we are all, every single one of us, in danger of doing. Maybe you're doing it at the moment. Maybe you are giving more weight to what you think God should be like than to what the Bible actually says God is like. And maybe you are giving more weight to how you think the Christian life should be lived than you are giving to what the Bible actually says about how the Christian life should be lived. What was it that hadn't fitted into their framework of the Messiah? Well, it was that the Messiah would suffer, verse 26. Jesus says, was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? Wasn't it necessary? They kind of got the glory bit right, but not the suffering. You see, they thought that God was going to redeem his people from suffering, but what they hadn't quite twigged was that God was going to redeem his people through suffering. They had thought that the Messiah was going to rescue them from their earthly slavery and captivity, and what they hadn't understood was that the Messiah was going to rescue them from their sin and their spiritual captivity. One person suggests that this passage should make us think of an earlier passage in Luke. They suggest that these two disciples should make us think of another two people in the Gospel of Luke. They suggest that they should make us think of Mary and Joseph in Luke 2. You remember Mary and Joseph in Luke 2, they're gone with the boy Jesus to Jerusalem, and then they had left Jerusalem, but then after a day of traveling, they realized that Jesus wasn't with them, and they don't know where he is. And so they anxiously go back to Jerusalem. And so you've got Mary and Joseph, they're traveling to Jerusalem. You've got these two disciples, they're traveling away from Jerusalem. And in both passages, two people are troubled and full of questions about Jesus. In both passages, two people think they've lost Jesus. And in both passages, two people don't understand really who Jesus is and what Jesus has come to do. And as Jesus said to Mary and Joseph in Luke 2, didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house? So here Jesus tells these two disciples about what it was necessary for him to do. He tells them about his Father's will. And beginning with the books of Moses, the first 5 books of the Bible, Jesus, he takes them on this wonderful whirlwind tour of the Old Testament, showing them how to interpret the Old Testament and explaining how it all points to him. And I wonder what verses, what passages, what books, what chapters did Jesus take them to? Wouldn't that just be amazing to have been there? I kind of think Jesus, maybe as he starts off, surely he would have taken them to Genesis 3 and verse 15. Surely Jesus would have taken them there. And surely Jesus would have said, well, yes, the seed, yes, the special child of the woman was going to crush the serpent's head. But remember, the serpent was going to bruise his heel. And maybe he took them to the life of Joseph and maybe said, well, yes, Joseph rose to that position of prominence and he became prime minister of Egypt and he was honored in that way. And he saved Israel and his family from starvation. But remember, he was also rejected by his family and his brothers. And he was treated violently and they beat him up and they sold him as a slave. Did he take them to Egypt and to the Exodus? And did he say, well, yes, through Moses, God saved his people, and there was these dramatic signs and wonders, and God opened up the Red Sea for them. But who do you think the Passover lambs were talking about? Did he take them to the Day of Atonement and explain to them what the two goats were pointing forward to? Did he take them to Isaiah 52 and 53? Surely he must have taken them to that servant song. Surely. And did he ask them a question and say, well, who do you think the servant is in this servant song? And they say, we think it's Israel. And he says, it's the Messiah. It's the Christ. And again and again and again and again, he shows them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. And as he did it, verse 32, their hearts were not just wonderfully warmed, their hearts just burned within them. Like this blazing spiritual bonfire there, that they were spiritually aglow as Jesus pointed in the scriptures to him. And wouldn't you have just loved to have been there? This must have been the most amazing Bible overview that has ever been given. The most amazing Bible study, and just lap it up. It's so exciting, so wonderful. Now remember, they still don't know who this stranger is. He's still a stranger to them. Their eyes are still being stopped from recognizing him. Jesus still hasn't revealed himself to them. And you ask the question, well, why? Well, because at this point, it is far more important that they see Christ correctly in the scriptures than that they see him standing in front of them, having come back from the dead. At this point, it is far more important that they see from the scriptures why he had to suffer and what he's come to do than it is for them to be comforted by the fact that Jesus is alive again but still have wrong ideas about him. You know, it's so important that you understand Christ as he's presented in the scriptures. And if you don't understand Christ as he's presented in the scriptures, you don't understand Christ as you're meant to. And what a privilege we have of seeing Christ in the Bible, in both Testaments, Old and New. And how precious, what a miracle if your eyes have been opened and they've been opened to see him in the scriptures, in his birth, in his life, in his death, in his resurrection, in his ascension, in his enthronement, in his return, who he is and what he came to do. And to you it's been given the greatest privilege to study the scriptures and to see Christ there. And I wonder, how much do you prize that privilege? How much do you devote yourself to seeing Christ in the scriptures? Is it one of the biggest priorities for your day each day? To walk with Christ in the scriptures. It was more important at this point that they saw him in the scriptures than that they saw him standing right in front of them, risen from the dead. And so we come on to verses 28 to 35, and Jesus eating with them. They get near to the village of Emmaus, which is presumably where they lived, and Jesus makes out that he's going to carry on walking. And verse 29, they strongly urge him to stay with them. And I suspect that the reason why they did that wasn't just because of the reason that they gave, because it was getting towards the evening and dark, but because they wanted him to tell them more about the Christ from the scriptures. Jesus, he accepts their offer, he stays with them, and then something unusual happens. Though they are the ones who are providing hospitality for this stranger takes the role of host. Verse 30, that's odd, that's unusual. That wouldn't normally happen. And he sits down at the table with them, and he takes the bread and he blesses it and he breaks it and he gives it to them. And in that moment, verse 31, their eyes are opened and they recognize him. It's him. He's alive. Wow. And you say, what was it about taking and blessing and breaking the bread that opened their eyes? And were they reminded of how Jesus did that in the feeding of the 5,000? Had the 11 disciples shared what had happened with Jesus in the upper room the night that he was betrayed? Or was it the formula of words that Jesus used? Or as Jesus stretched out his hands to give them the bread, did they see the nail marks in his hands and they recognized him? And he used that to open their eyes. Their eyes are opened. And yet the moment they recognize that it's him, he vanishes and disappears. One moment he's with them, and the next moment he's gone. One person points out that this meal and what happens with the opening of the eyes, that they point out that this meal should remind us of the very first meal we have recorded for us in the Bible. So going back to the book of Genesis and chapter 3, and how Eve, she took the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and she gave it to Adam, and they both ate of it. And what do we find happened in verse 7 of Genesis 3? Their eyes were opened. And what were Adam and Eve's eyes open to? They were open to sin and to shame and to guilt and to death. And yet as these two have their eyes opened, what are their eyes open to? They are opened to hope and to redemption and to life. For here in front of them is a dead man who is alive again. Their Redeemer. The curse has been broken. The grave has been defeated. A new creation has begun. The winter is over. And the spring has come. And new life has burst into this world of death. And what happened when Adam and Eve ate the fruit? Well, God became a stranger to them. They started to run away from God and hide from God, and they could no longer walk with God as they once did. Well, what happened when this stranger broke bread with these two? Well, they realized that this stranger was none other than the Lord, their friend. The one who had just walked with them. And you see, Jesus is restoring things to the way things once were. And if God is a stranger to you this morning, if all that you can see is your sin and your guilt and all that you've done wrong and the consequences that you deserve and death, ask God to open your eyes to Jesus this morning. To see him as the one who is risen from the grave, who is able to redeem his people, who is full of grace and mercy, and who is able to save you. And if God has already opened your eyes to these things, you are so blessed. A miracle has taken place. As these two, they review things, suddenly everything clicks into place. And they say, no wonder our hearts burned within us as we walked with Jesus and he explained the scriptures to us. And even though the reason they gave to Jesus to stay with them was because it was getting late, verse 33, they immediately start walking back to Jerusalem. They start walking the 7 miles back. Why? Because they want to tell the 11 disciples what has just happened. They're so excited. They want to tell them it's true. He really is alive. We've seen him. We've walked with him. We've talked with him. And in your imagination, compare their faces to how their faces look in verse 17. No longer are they looking sad, but their faces, they are shining with light and with joy and with hope. And as they walk back, surely they are praising God for all that God has done. And they're so looking forward to going through the door and saying, you'll never guess what. And yet, have a look at verse 34. By the time they get there, the 11 disciples already know. For by this time, Jesus has already appeared to Peter. Now, I used to read verses 34 and 35 completely wrong, so this probably just exposes the pride of my heart. But just I used to kind of just imagine them rushing back to Jerusalem as quickly as possible, and they are so excited about being the first to give the disciples the news. That they're so excited that they're going to be the ones to turn their night into day, to transform their sorrow, transform their sorrow into joy. And they're looking back to being, they're looking forward to being the first that break the news, and they get back, and Peter's stolen their thunder. And you think, what a letdown. Their balloons have been pricked. How deflating. That's how I used to think. But it's not like that at all, is it? These two disciples, they are strengthened to hear that Jesus has appeared to Peter. It's confirmation. It's reinforcement. It's an extra cause for thanksgiving. And they gladly share their story. And although we live hundreds of years after them, and though some of you have been Christians for a long, long time now, one of my prayers for this morning is that their sense of joy and hope and excitement rubs off on you. That you too are filled with wonder and amazement. Jesus is alive. The tomb is empty. He's come back from the dead. The curse has been broken. The grave has been defeated. A new creation has begun. Winter is finished with, and the spring has arrived. And one day, the one who you love to see in the scriptures, one day he's going to be standing there right in front of you. Because Jesus is real. And Jesus is coming back. And he's going to eat and he's going to drink with you. And your hearts are going to burn within you as you look at him in love, and as you look at him in all of his glory and his radiance and his beauty. Because he lives, you can face tomorrow. Because one day that tomorrow is going to be the day that he comes back, and you will be with him forever.